so divine. Demands my heart, my soul, my life, my all. The echoing. And this is about giving our heart and soul. It's about giving to God every attitude of our hearts. I always end up speaking about attitudes, don't I? Because living our life is make or break, isn't it? I read something that Oscar Wilde said. He says, "We're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." And I also read that the hardening of the heart attitude is the most deadly disease on the face of the earth. And it's very true. I'm going to look first of all at 2 Samuel 13. Again, it's a story we know very well. So we're going to start at verse 20. But before that, the story goes that David's son, Amnon, was lusting after David's son Absalom's sister, Tamar. And with the help of the crafty man, as he's called Jonadab, he lured Tamar into his bedchamber and he defiled her against her will. He raped her. She was a virgin. And after that, he was struck with hatred for her and he threw her out. And Absalom then found her devastated with torn clothes and with ashes on her head. So we'll pick it up at verse 20. Her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet, for now, my sister, he is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar remained a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he became very angry. But he wouldn't punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he'd raped his sister Tamar. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Absalom came to the king and said, "Your servant has sheep shearers. Will the king and his servants please go with your servant?" But the king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go, or else we'll be burdensome to you." He pressed him, but he would not go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." The king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Absalom made a feast like a king's feast. Then Absalom commanded his servants, "Watch when Amnon's heart is merry with wine. And when I say to you, 'Strike Amnon,' then kill him. Do not be afraid. Have I not myself commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons rose, and each mounted his mule and fled. While they were on their way, the report came to David that Absalom had killed all the king's sons, and not one of them was left. The king rose, tore his garments, and lay on the ground. And all his servants who were standing by tore their garments. But Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shimei, said, "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons. Amnon alone is dead. This has been determined by Absalom from the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. Now therefore do not let my lord the king take it to heart, as if all his sons were dead, for Amnon alone is dead." But Absalom fled. When the young man who kept watch looked up, he saw many people coming from the Horonaim road by the side of the mountain. Jonadab said to the king, "See, the king's sons have come. As your servant said, so it has come about. As soon as he'd finished speaking, the king's sons arrived and raised their voices and wept, and the king and his servants wept very bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. David mourned for his son day after day. Absalom, having fled to Geshur, stayed there 3 years, and the heart of the king went out, yearning for Absalom, for now he was consoled over the death of Amnon. The reason I started with this is because it's a classic example of what happens when we take offence at something. When offence is taken, even if it's deemed to be justified, at some action and nursed over a period of time. In verse 22, Absalom spoke to his brother, neither good nor bad, for he hated Amnon because of what he'd done to Tamar. Absalom was really offended, but he didn't deal with it. He kept it in his heart. 2 years passed, and Absalom then planned and got Amnon, his brother, killed. So what started off as an offence, which could have been sorted out, spiralled into betrayal, hatred, and ultimately murder. Offence, once it enters our hearts, must be rooted out completely. Otherwise it can come back and claim victims and do more damage. See, Absalom later on betrayed his dad, and he ended up being killed. What began as a disapproval of his half-brother's actions led to betrayal, hatred and murder. Untamed offence, mixed with confusion about his father's failings, resulted in Absalom's death and devastation for everyone else. Now, none of us, I'm sure, are nurturing anything horrendous like that. But there are 2 principles here I want to talk about today. That of offending someone and that of taking offence. And before we think about taking offence, because that's what we generally think about, isn't it, the taking offence, we need to get one thing straight, that we all do and say things that offend people, that can offend people. Often we do it unknowingly and unwittingly. Occasionally we do it out of choice. In Luke 17, Yeshua is speaking to his followers and he says, it's impossible that no offences will come. It's impossible to go through life without us doing or saying something that's going to upset other people. It's impossible for us not to upset people sometimes. And we all likewise have experiences where people upset us and disappoint us and let us down. Offences happen. They're part of life. They're part of the life we live. And we can't escape them because we're not perfect. It's impossible, Yeshua says, that we're not going to face some offensive behaviour, attitudes or words. So often we tend to think that an offence is something someone else does that hurts me and makes me feel bad. And actually my feelings are my feelings. But you know, there's no one responsible for my feelings but me. And you say, oh well, he made me feel angry. No, he didn't make you feel angry. It was your choice to feel angry. It's your response to what he said that riled you, that made you feel angry. So we apportion blame on other people. And we don't look at what's going on in our own life. And consequently, we miss the chance to grow. In James 3 verse 2 it says, we all offend in many things. We offend in many things. All of us. And it says, if any man doesn't offend with his words, then he's perfect. Anybody perfect here? Oh, Jane is. That's great. Let's all do it Jane's way. If we don't offend, we're perfect. And we can bridle our tongue. But then you think about it, Yeshua is perfect. Did he cause offence? did. Yeah. He caused offence because of who he is and the gospel he preaches. So the reality is we offend. We all offend. We offend with the words we speak. We offend with our attitude, which shows how we speak sometimes. And if all of us do it, then we need to stop thinking that we're better than anybody else. We need to stop blaming other people, because we're all offenders. And it may be unwittingly, because we may be telling the truth, speaking the truth, which is offensive to someone else. It doesn't always mean that what we're saying is bad or what we're doing is bad. It just means it creates difficulties because the other person isn't on the same wavelength as we are. The Bible's full of lots of men, and I'm sure women, but I didn't go into that, who get offended and end up missing God's purpose for their lives in some areas. We just heard about Absalom. What about Saul? All was well with Saul, but then we read in 1 Samuel 18, 7-13, that Saul was very offended because David was so popular. Saul went out one day and heard the ladies singing, and how lovely, you know, Saul's killed 1,000. Wonderful, great. And then they say, but David's killed 10,000. And immediately Saul's offended. So what does he try and do? He tries to kill David. He nurtures the hatred in his heart. And in 2 Samuel 17:23, when, I can never say this, Ahithophel saw that his counsel wasn't followed, he saddled his donkey and he went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and he hanged himself. He died and was buried in the tomb with his father. He betrayed David because of offence. His advice before had always been esteemed. He was looked up to. But on this occasion it was ignored. And that offence led to separation and to death. And we can find this pattern all the way through the Bible. You know, Genesis 4, Cain. He got offended. Why? Because God seemed to accept his brother's offering, but not his offering. God spoke to him and said, don't be cast down, don't get all upset. But instead of listening, he became angry and depressed and hated and killed his brother. Joseph was the youngest son. His father seemed to like him and gave him a special coat. And his brothers took offence. They were jealous. They hated him. Joseph was given prophetic dreams by God and had a great dream of his life. And then he spoke it out, he shared it. I saw this dream where you all bowed down to me, and they hated him more. They took even more offence. They were offended by what he seemed to have in God, and instead of blessing him, they decided to do away with him. 2 Kings 5, 9-17, Naaman. He was the leper and he was looking for healing. But when he got to the place he thought he was going to receive healing, the prophet, he thought the prophet would come out, wave his hand over him and say, you're healed. But the prophet didn't even come out and see him, did he? The prophet just said, go down into the water, dip in the water 7 times and you'll be healed. But he was offended. He was furious and he nearly lost his healing and died prematurely because of offence. And why should he be offended? He was offended because somebody didn't do something the way he thought they should do it. Because God didn't work the way he thought God would work. And so it goes on. More and more evidence that human beings both often unintentionally cause offence and harbour offence and malice in hearts. But Yeshua teaches a better way. Now, he had every right to be offended. And then on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So what is offence? Well, this word offence here comes from the Greek word scandalon, and it means to set a snare, a noose or a trap. It also means something that makes somebody stumble or fall. Taking offence generally means to feel annoyed or hurt by something that somebody said or done. It may be as simple as somebody coming in today and walking past you and not greeting you. It may be as simple as somebody sitting in your seat. Somebody pinched your cushion. Somebody fell asleep when you were speaking. Don't you just know that it's the really small things quite often? And then sometimes that really small thing, you sit on it and you think, I should be sitting there really, that's my seat. And it bubbles up inside, and because of it, you actually can't worship. Because that's all you can focus on. It's just a silly little example, but it is the small things quite often. And you think, you sit there and you think, oh, what's going on? Something's going on. God's not here today. Yes, he is. But you're not in the right place to hear from him. If your heart's not right, you can't enjoy, you can't access what God's doing. Because, you know, he's here, he's in us, he's with us. He doesn't suddenly disappear when offence comes. And Yeshua made it very, very clear that wherever there are people, there's going to be offence. Now, we'd like to think, wouldn't we, that if we come into church, there won't be offence. Yeah? And you know, that should be so. Especially with mature Christians. But then you think, well, who comes to church? Why do we come to church? People who need to know the love of Yeshua. People who need the safety and security of our Saviour. People who need to know they're loved. Damaged, broken people. People who've got things going on in their lives that they can't solve. We come, he accepts us, he loves us, and he says, okay, let's start our journey. Our failings and difficulties do not end like that. And we may think that, you know, a bit of offence is a bit harmless really, isn't it? It's not as if it's, you know, I don't indulge in any of the big sins. But the weapon of offence can cause us much damage if we're not careful. But you say, but what they said, what they did was offensive. It was harmful, it was wrong, it was damaging. And what the religious leaders and the Roman soldiers did to Yeshua was damaging, was offensive, was harmful, was wrong. But what did he do? So why do we get offended? Well, we're not clones, are we? We're all different people, very different people. But there are some common reasons for getting offended, no matter who we are. And the first one is that we are imperfect. Psalm 51:5, behold, I was shaped in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. We carry all kinds of experiences, of traumas, of fears from our past, from our present, from generations, which greatly influence our behaviour. We all differ in opinions, in our ideas, in our perceptions. The danger is that if we allow offence in our life, it can stop the blessing of God from flowing in our lives. But when we exercise patience and we remain focused on God and His Word, He does turn the situations around. And the more I thought about this message as I was preparing for it, the more it became clear, the message we bring in Father's house is one which can and does cause offence to other Christians. It causes offence to us for when God highlights the next thing that we have to deal with and tackle. Because it makes us question everything we've ever learnt and ever known. And hear me, I'm not saying that that we're always right, because none of us are always right. But we all have responsibility to weigh and test. But the message, the Word of God brings offence. And we need to bring our message in love to those who will hear it. But then it made me also think that the responsibility, once the message has been heard, is actually theirs to weigh and to test, to measure, to see if they disagree or struggle with it. It's theirs to deal with in the right way. It's not ours anymore. And the same can be said vice versa when we learn things from other Christians. If they say something to us that we don't agree with, that we disagree with, that we think, oh, the responsibility is ours to deal with that the right way. And that is the key to keeping relationships going. That is the key to having unity in God's kingdom. And what a mess we've made of it. Christendom, what a mess we've made of it, because we love God. God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. We should be one body. But we've all taken offence at each other in so many ways. And that is our wrongdoing. I'm talking about everybody who has taken offence in any way. That is our wrongdoing. When we disagree with people and when people disagree with us, what we need to do is keep blessing them and then keep blessing us. It's the hearts of people that need to be right with God. You see, God is bigger than we can possibly imagine. He watches over His word. He ensures it is fulfilled. And yes, we have responsibility to preach the gospel. We have responsibility to give away that which God has given us. But He watches over His word. Jeremiah 1, I'm watching over my word to see that it's fulfilled. Quite a lot of us take on that false responsibility afterwards, and when we've given it out, we take on that false responsibility of, oh, but it wasn't received. And such has gone away offended because of it. But that's not ours to have. And likewise, if somebody says something to us which they believe is the truth and we get offended by it, we need to do something about that, because that's not their responsibility either. When we speak to people, when we speak to Christians and non-Christians, our battle in the Word of God is not personal, is it? It's not with flesh and blood. In Matthew 24, Yeshua says that, when he's talking about the end times, that his word will bring division and offence in the last days. And that's what's happening. And as I prepared for this, it became more and more clear that that's what's happening. But we as a body have a responsibility not to be offended, as other bodies, parts of the body have a responsibility not to be offended and to deal with things the right way. Sometimes we can even become offended at God, can't we? For allowing things to happen in our lives. But you know, it's a bit daft really, because he's the only one who can get us out of it. Isaiah 45:9 says, "Woe to him who strives with his maker." Job says, "Who has hardened himself against God and prospered?" We need to be very careful that we don't harden our hearts. It's God's desire that we don't become offended, that we die to ourselves. And again, as we sung those words today, it demands my soul, my mind, my will, my emotions, my life, my heart, my very being, my all. Not the bits. Not that I can take any bits back for myself like this because they did this to me. It demands every part of us, every part of our minds, our hearts. And we know that our hearts are deceitful above all things. Philippians 1:9-11, "And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offence, till the day of Yeshua, being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God." So we saw at the beginning a little bit about what happens when we get offended. The consequence of taking offence, and you won't like this, is that you're doing the work of the devil. Same for me. When we take offence, we agree with Satan. We begin to manifest feelings of anger, of resentment, of wrath, of criticism. We become a people who then start to cause offence. Remember, this means setting a snare, a stumbling block for somebody else. And we do this because somebody's offended us, so we go and backbite. And we share our grievance with other people because we want them to agree with us. And ultimately that leads to division, to rebellion, to fighting, to warring. When we allow ourselves to be offended and we don't deal with it, it leads to other very damaging human emotions like betrayal and hatred. And I bet we could all think of marriages that we know that this has happened in, of workplaces, of businesses, of churches. Proverbs 18:19. "A brother offended is harder to win than a fortified city." That means it's easier to conquer a fortified city than to reconcile with a brother who's offended. That's serious, isn't it? One of the most potent weapons that Satan uses in these days is the weapon of offence. Matthew 24, "And then many will be offended, will betray one another and will hate one another." Offence provokes and triggers betrayal. Whenever you feel like betraying somebody, it's probably because you're offended. Colossians 3:12-14. "Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercy, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against each other, Even as Yeshua forgave you, so you must also do. But above all these things, put on the bond of love, which is the bond of perfection. Isn't it common, if I think about over the years that I've been in church, to find people who used to be on fire and fully supporting whatever ministry, who then turned into antagonists? Usually because they've taken offence at something. If we don't deal with offence properly, hatred and a spirit of murder will arise in our heart. And we seek to find a way to deal with that person. And it always happens in very subtle ways. You know, not like the biblical examples I've given you. We don't go out and murder people quite often. Well, usually. We find subtler ways. We find someone else to talk to and download. And once you start downloading, you begin to spread the offence. And you lay the trap that somebody may stumble into without even knowing it, without even seeing it coming. How many of us have talked with somebody and they've downloaded some things, and afterwards we've had this feeling inside that's really unsettled us, and we found it difficult to get peace afterwards? It's really quite common, because when you're talking about somebody else, the next time you see that person, you react differently to them. Something's happened. It's like a hidden agenda. And Proverbs 26 talks about this. From verse 24 it says, "He who hates disguises it with his lips." He wraps it up. He lays up deceit within himself. When he speaks kindly, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness will be revealed before the assembly. See, the words of one who is offended starts to gossip and slander the offender. And you know, our sin natures delight in hearing things like that, don't they? And it goes right down to our belly and it affects our spirit. What he's really saying is this: when people have got offences in their heart and hatred in their heart, they cover it with nice talk, but eventually it comes out anyway. We can't stop what is in our heart flowing out. Proverbs 17:9, "Whoever would foster love covers over an offence, but whoever repeats the matter separates close friends." We have to make choices about this kind of thing. When a person does this to us, and we sit down and we listen and we give them a really good listen, and then this happens, and their agenda is that they want to draw us into what's happening in their life because they want us to agree with them and want us to say, "Oh, that was awful." And they want us to feel upset about it too. And why do they want us to agree? Because they've got no peace in their heart anymore, and they need us to tell them it's okay. And when that happens and we let that in, division comes against the offender. Division is created in relationships. You know, offences in marriage divide the marriage. Offences in family divide the family. How many of our families have taken offence at each other over and over again? Offences in church divide the church. It's a spiritual principle. But we have to deal with it, because obviously the fruit of it is really bad. So there's another thing. If somebody comes to you with an offence, the first thing we do is guard our heart. We're only hearing one side of the story. We need to ask appropriate questions. It doesn't mean to say that we're not here to hear each other, but we deal with it God's way. We ask them why they can't actually talk to the person about it. What's stopping them? We can pray with them. We can show them the way forward. We can help them to decide to do it God's way. We've all had many, many reasons to be offended, I'm sure, and we still do. But we have to learn to rise with grace in our hearts and say, Yeshua, help me to be somebody who helps to reconcile, not who makes things worse. We need to be people who pour oil to soothe and to calm. And if we're the ones that are getting offended, we need to check our own conduct and allow God to convict us first before we can deal with anybody else. So we've looked at what offence does. On a personal level, what are the signs that somebody may be offended? Well, the first thing they start to do is withdraw. Withdraw from relationships. Withdraw from fellowship. They separate, they isolate themselves. See, relationships are created by God to strengthen us and to empower us in godly relationships. They're a blessing. The Bible says that two are better than one and have a better reward for their labour. Sometimes churches split as a result of somebody who's been offended. And often an offended person will start to stay away and withhold their support, withhold their approval, withhold their contributions. The Bible says we shouldn't forsake the assembly of gathering together. So withdrawal, resentment. If you find that you are resentful towards somebody, it's a good sign that you're offended. Resentment is harbouring animosity against somebody you feel has mistreated you in some way. It may be unresolved anger over a negative event, but it's bad because it damages you. It consumes the joy and the peace of mind. It's self-destructive. It can lead to bitterness, of course. It can lead to fatigue. You know, there are all sorts of ailments and illnesses that are caused from resentment and bitterness and unforgiveness. Offence leads to distrust. Offended people begin to lose their trust for other people. Offence leads to difficulty in submitting to authority. You develop an independent spirit when you take offence. Offence, as we heard, leads to betrayal. The betrayal of love, the betrayal of friendships, disloyalty. Many people, because they're offended, start to betray the trust of their closest friends. Offence leads to unanswered prayers. Yeshua says in Mark 11 that if we hold anything against anyone, we have to forgive them, so that our Father in heaven will forgive us. Let's not be offended at anyone to the extent that we stop doing what we're supposed to be doing for God. Offence leads to rebellion. Often people who are offended develop a rebellious spirit and go against the order of things. You know, Absalom rebelled against David's kingship because of offence. When young people rebel against their parents, and I know because I've been there, it's usually the result of some kind of offence. And we cook up all these plans in our mind to do things differently and to get back. And God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay. And offence also leads to a distorted account, a distorted recollection of events. You know, offended people have a very good memory, don't they? But it's very selective because they always remember the wrongs committed against them and they leave out everything that's good. So how do we deal with offence so that it doesn't become part of us? Well, we have to get our mindset right. We have to have it firmly established in our heart and our mind that unforgiveness and offence is not an option. Luke 17, Yeshua says to his disciples, things that cause people to stumble are bound to come. But woe to anyone through whom they come. It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. And then he says, so watch yourselves. You know, Yeshua's first priority is that we should, when something happens that offends us, watch ourselves. See how we deal with it, our personal response. Because our flesh nature often determines that we respond by focusing on them. They did this, they've done that. And we go through this awful turmoil. But Yeshua says, okay, that's happened. Look at yourself. Watch yourself. Guard the condition of your heart when you face something that upsets you. Life is about people. And people do weird and wonderful things. And the result is we often get hurt and have misunderstandings. And we can do one or two things. We can use them as a chance to grow, or we can begin the downward spiral that stunts our growth. So to deal with offence, we have to face what's in our hearts, the beliefs of our hearts. We have to get our hearts right with God. We have to forgive and bless. It doesn't mean that we always agree. But only when our heart's right and we're acting in God's spirit can we then go and talk to people about the issues. If we're not free, if we're still acting in that spirit of offence, we will cause major damage and we will get damaged. What's in our heart will come out. So we're better to get our heart right. So we have no agenda, but that we want to be reconciled, want to be restored. We want to be in unity under God. And that's what God blesses. He blesses unity. And that's what brings healing to relationships. That's what brings wholeness. If we could just get it right, can you imagine how different we would be as Christians? Can you imagine how different the church would be? So what do we need to do when it happens? We need to forgive quickly. Forgiveness means to release, to dismiss, to cancel debt. It's the ability to release people and events and hurts and bitterness from your heart. It's that feeling of no longer holding things against anyone. We need to make a decision straight away that we're not going to take revenge. We're not allowed to take revenge. Our vengeance isn't ours, irrespective of what the offence is. God's the only one who has the right to take vengeance, because he's all-knowing. Luke 9 says, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Yeshua resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into the Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there didn't welcome him, because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? And we would have gone, yes, wouldn't we? But Yeshua turned and rebuked them. We have to give the situation to God in prayer and stop talking about it. And that's really hard, isn't it, sometimes? But the problem is, when we start to talk about something, the enemy makes it bigger than it was. Giving it to God and leaving it there is the only way forward. And we have to choose to love unconditionally. You know, the true test of love is the capacity to forgive. If we have the mind to hold offences against somebody, we're not loving. We're in the wrong place in that part of our relationship with God. Romans 13:8, owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the Torah. Two scriptures to close. Ephesians 4:26-27. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry. And do not give the devil a foothold. And a more uplifting one, Proverbs 19:11. A person's wisdom yields patience. It's to one's glory to overlook an offence.